Sorry. Bolivarian Revolution. I'd like to call upon the Prime Minister to deliver his 7-minute address.
Support this motion that opposes something here today. We're going to give you a bit of a model as to how we think the Catholic Church should, oppose the Bolivarian Revolution. We're going to discuss what we think the Bolivarian Revolution means in light of our definition that was given to us earlier. And then I'm going to have a look at the idea that it doesn't role of the Catholic Church in society. And then I'm going to go and have a look at why the Bolivarian Revolution undermines the teachings of the Church, and therefore why, in fact, the Church should oppose it. Stephen is going to have a look at the interaction between the Church and politics in general. So without further ado, what we're talking about. The Catholic Church should oppose the Bolivarian Revolution the same way it opposes many political stances and issues the world over, such as how it opposes abortion in the United States, etc. Ladies and gentlemen, we think it should use its influence through its priests to encourage the congregations not to partake in these practices, and not, or in this case, not to vote for set leaders like Chavez, Morales, etc. We think that it should use its influence generally, and we think that's basically what we mean by this claim. So what exactly are we talking about here? We're talking about the Bolivarian Revolution. We're talking about governments that are overly nationalistic, that are authoritarian, ladies and gentlemen, that undermine freedom of press, that undermine individual undermine, ladies and gentlemen, basically the fundamental precepts under which the Catholic Church exists and which the Catholic Church should seek to support, ladies and gentlemen. No thank you. So, what is the role of the Catholic Church, ladies and gentlemen? It is a role as moral leaders. The Catholic Church is a moral organisation. It is an organisation that if you are a member of that organisation, you subscribe to the belief that the church has moral authority to tell you what to do because, ladies and gentlemen, is a belief system. It is a body of unwavering belief, no thank you, in the face of any contemporary adverse standpoint that comes up against it, ladies and gentlemen. People who willingly subscribe to that membership accept by doing so that the church should provide moral rights. Yes?
Are you guys applying this model everywhere in the world or only in Latin America? Should they oppose injustice everywhere?
The church definitely opposes injustice. I don't think that's a necessarily different point to take, but we're talking specifically here about the Bolivarian Revolution. If there are other areas that meet the same type of criteria, I have no issue with that, ladies and gentlemen. But we're going to talk about these specifics that we can lay before the House today. So, ladies and gentlemen, the church has also always had a political role, from right back to its inception, back in, the year zero, whatever, well, no, a little bit later. But anyway, the idea here is the idea that the church has always been involved in politics. The church has always had this role in political thought. It has had a role in government for long periods of time, and it has always had influence over the politics of nations. And Stephen's going to develop that more in his point. But what I want to talk about now is a more important issue, ladies and gentlemen, which is basically why we think the Bolivarian Revolution and the leaders, etc., and their policies are basically crap, and why we don't like them, ladies and gentlemen. Why we think they undermine the teachings of the church, and why the church, therefore, and consequently, should oppose them. So, firstly, as I said earlier, they're overly nationalistic, ladies and gentlemen. The church understands that nationalism as a concept is a dangerous thing. Nationalism undermines the ability of people to discuss, to integrate, and seeing as the church's fundamental goal is to achieve a holy and undivided communion of the world at one point, I think nationalism as a concept kind of harms that in principle. No thank you. Because what it does, ladies and gentlemen, is the influence of the church as well. If you are overly nationalistic, you are less likely to listen to the church. That is a bad thing for the church. First off, ladies and gentlemen, I'll take you in a moment on this, sir. And we think that the issue is also that nationalism, if you have a look at areas such as the Balkans, etc., has generally led to serious tensions, serious harms, and things, that don't generally result in peace, which is, again, one of the church's main issues.
Okay, so you honestly believe that nationalism to an intensely and historically Catholic country, for instance, Venezuela, undermines the Catholic Church?
Okay. It's about a situation, sir, where you're talking about a group of leaders who are both authoritarian and trying to stir up a level of nationalism that is unprecedented, a level of nationalism that doesn't respect the Catholic Church, a level of nationalism that is different to the previous Catholic nationalism. Now they want to form a socialist nationalism that undermines the position of the Catholic Church within that society. But I want to move on to the authoritarian area, ladies and gentlemen. This is probably the most important here. This is basically why we think, in general, these governments are outrageous, ladies and gentlemen. Because they attempt to become a moral enforcer, which is the role of the church, ladies and gentlemen. If morale is effectively decriminalising coca, ladies and gentlemen, we think there's an issue with that. We don't think the church should support anyone who does that. In fact, we think the church should actively oppose anyone who is into drug production, etc., ladies and gentlemen. We think that is a moral standpoint that the church ought to take, and in fact, definitely should take. No thank you, ladies and gentlemen. There's also the idea that these governments are clamping down on freedom, ladies and gentlemen, individual freedom. In particular, media freedom. You have a look at the idea of Chavez closing down, ladies and gentlemen, one of the television stations there last year, because it opposed what he believed, ladies and gentlemen. It spouted positions that were contrary to his own beliefs, and he closed down a station, ladies and gentlemen. The church has always opposed authoritarianism. The church should always oppose authoritarianism, ladies and gentlemen. The church, ladies and gentlemen, has a duty as a moral arbiter, as a moral compass to its people, to encourage people to stand up against an authoritarian regime that is undermining the freedoms, no thank you, of that very people, and undermining freedoms, ladies and gentlemen, in general, in terms of both media and individual freedom, ladies and gentlemen. Also, there is a general increase in antagonism towards the West, ladies and gentlemen, or Western countries, which we think is an issue, again, because it doesn't lead to any stability in the region. What it does do is it undermines any attempt for dialogue, it undermines any attempt, ladies and gentlemen, for there to be general improvement in the rights of persons and a general improvement in the dialogue between nations, ladies and gentlemen, things which the church in general have things like coca, you have things like this. They are a bad idea economically, ladies and gentlemen. They squander resources. And ladies and gentlemen, there's a more fundamental principle that the redistribution of wealth that is going on in these countries is under a principle which undermines the Catholic norm, ladies and gentlemen, that you must work in order to achieve what you want, ladies and gentlemen. The current situation in these countries is that you aren't really required to work. Redistribution is contrary to that fundamental Catholic principle, ladies and gentlemen. It's for all those reasons that I'm more than happy to propose.
Thank you. I'd like to call upon the leader of the opposition to bring forth the opposition side.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I think what a really fundamental issue is when we're talking about how the church should interact with the state is what areas the church concedes legitimacy to the state and what areas the church retains legitimacy for itself. We have an idea that we're going to present of an idea that there's different spheres of sovereignty in society, an idea that in some things should be left to the government, while in other areas the church can act autonomously and can have legitimacy there. The reason that we think this is good is because we think that it allows the church to be most effective in its role. And so we think when the Catholic Church is deciding what line to take, they should take the line that will maintain a healthy church-state relationship, that will allow it to further its aims both in Venezuela and these countries, and also around the world. So I'm going to tell you constructively about why this particular plan undermines the capabilities of the church when it comes to proselytization and the delivery of services, both in Venezuela and also around the world internationally. I'm also going to tell you that this is an ineffective plan that won't produce some of the benefits that they talk about. Okay, so in terms of undermining capabilities, what we see is that governments are willing to concede, even in sort of vaguely totalitarian areas, they allow churches to operate under the premise that the churches are not operating as political actors. So I asked, are you going to apply the standard everywhere? And they said, wherever there's injustice. So that means they're going to stand up in China and oppose Chinese policies like the one-child program. We say when you stand up in places like that, and even when you stand up in Venezuela, and you oppose policies that a very powerful state has put in place, what you're doing is delegitimizing yourself in that context. You're reducing the likelihood of the state being willing to respect your right to operate in a moral realm. Go.
Given that opposition parties and the media are being cracked down on in these countries, don't you think the Catholic Church has a duty to act?
I think if the Catholic Church starts acting, it's going to get cracked down on in a very similar way, and we think that's very problematic. In Venezuela, they might be somewhat immune to that kind of cracking down. That's an interesting thing to talk about. I'll hear about that later, I'm sure. But in other countries, like in China, they don't have any resilience to that kind of thing. And so when the Vatican takes the stance that internationally we're going to entwine ourselves in political issues and sets a precedent that they're a political actor, we think that in other areas where they're less immune from crackdown, they're going to face severe resistance. But we're going to say that even in Venezuela, there will be resistance. Because right now, the church can act internationally as a kind of international Red Cross, where they don't take a side on a lot of issues. They take a side on moral issues, like abortion, but they don't say what kind of regulatory regime you should have in your stock market, because it's attenuated from the values that are in place. We think that when the church starts playing a more active political role, that it's going to suffer the consequences of being a political actor. Go.
Okay, sir. How is the cracking down on media freedom, the individual freedom of these Catholics in these countries, not a moral issue for the church to defend?
What we think that in general, you can say that a Catholic value exists against persecution. But we would say that Catholics need to prioritize the values that they're pursuing. Because we haven't seen, in this case, that them standing up for these television stations is going to result in the television stations remaining open. What we would tell you is that the church retains legitimacy when it's pursuing an agenda that's clearly backed by, that there's a great canonical consensus behind it. When it says something like this life agenda and anti-abortion, when it says something like freedom of religion and freedom of practice generally. But when the church goes out on a limb to defend political values, like freedom of speech, that have not always and everywhere been upheld by the Catholic Church, they're kind of sticking their head out. And we think that's problematic, and that will result in them getting curtailed. Okay, being recognized as a political actor means that you have to deal with the consequences of being perceived as a political actor. We think by retaining a certain sovereign neutrality, the church can say, look, we're going to just preach values to our people. We're not telling them politically, bring down the state. We think once the state says the church is teaching their people, bring down the state, the church is now in a meaningful way an enemy faction to the state, and is going to perceive the similar kinds of treatment that other enemy factions receive. We think that churches, maybe they won't, the churches is much better off when it can practice freely, when it can proselytize freely, when it can deliver services freely. And so we think if the risk here is that you're going to get your proselytization cut back, we're talking about sacrificing souls for the small chance of influencing press freedom. We say that's not something they should go with. We think that the church might be legitimate when they condemn the Soviet Union for failing to allow free practice of religion. But we think that when they go further and condemn their economic systems and their modes of redistribution, that's attenuated from the doctrine that everyone sees as being within the purview of the church. So why is this plan ineffective? Because they haven't given you any analysis whatsoever about how the church telling their people, hey, being oppressed sucks, is going to lead to meaningful political change. Like, we think a lot of people in these countries recognize that being oppressed sucks, but when you've got a state at this time where there's despotic rulers who have the ability to manipulate the press, who have the ability to manipulate the media, it's very difficult for just sheer popular sentiment to change things. We also think that a lot of people in these countries are emotionally and politically committed to the causes that we're talking about, to these Bolivarian revolutions. And so when you allow people, when you say, no, that's wrong, you're actually undermining your legitimacy with your own constituents, with your own parishioners, because it's not absolutely clear the Bolivarian revolution and its emphasis on equality and something that guy 2,000 years ago sort of talked about. It's not absolutely clear that it's always antithetical to Catholic beliefs. Now they told you on their side that it's a belief system that is all-encompassing, but we would say it's a moral belief system that should be limited to a more moral religious space, because when you try to extend into a political domain, that's very problematic, as I've said. Then they said nationalism, Bolivarianism sucks, nationalism sucks. Well, yeah, but there's nationalism all over the world, and we don't oppose it all over the world, because if we did, we would undermine the status of the Catholic Church everywhere, because lots of people think nationalism is legitimate. They also say, oh, closed media is really bad, and these things are very bad. Like, we see lots of bad things in the world. That doesn't mean that the Catholic Church should oppose all of them when it will convey harms on itself without producing any tangible benefits. And they said there's bad governance that results from this, and that kind of governance is incompatible with our personal theology. But what we would tell you is it's not the role of the church to pass sort of its moral verdict on whether or not a particular policy, a particular redistributionary issue is legitimate or not. And we think when they try to do that, they extend into a speech where they're going to get slapped back. We oppose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for his remarks and call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to deliver his 7-minute address. Here.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, members of the opposition, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not sure what kind of Catholic church the leader of the opposition has grown up with that stays out of politics, that never speaks up when injustice rears its head, that says that our values should be to stay within this country and not stand up for our morality. It's certainly not the Catholic Church that we stand proudly for from Ireland. He told us in his speech that these leaders are despotic rulers manipulating the state through the press and oppressing opposition. That is the very value that the Catholic Church has stood for and should always stand for, ladies and gentlemen. The values that they stand for are the freedom of individuals, the liberty of the state not oppressing people, the state not taking action against opposition groups, the state not oppressing free speech and the media. I want to look at some rebuttal, and then I'm going to move on to talk about my individual point about the interaction of religion and politics. Let's look at this idea that the Catholic Church are somehow going to lose influence. First off, this idea of China. The reason that many Catholic priests and bishops are in jail in China at the moment is they have stood up to oppression. This is not a new idea, ladies and gentlemen. It's what they do at the moment. We think they should just do it more often and in a more voiceful and vigorous way. It's not changing their position, it's adapting it to the current situation. Let's look more at this idea. What is the point in the Catholic Church having leadership if it loses its moral role with its constituents? What is the point of a Catholic Church that exists when it doesn't stand up to oppression, when it ignores its core and basic values in the aim of simply staying in position in the state. The Catholic Church has always said, we are willing to be expelled from a country, we are willing to be oppressed, we are willing to go to jail, and we are willing to be martyred in order to stand up for our belief system. The Catholic Church that they want to give you is a namby-pamby morality that has no application to the real world. That's not the kind of morality that the Catholic Church has stood for, and it's certainly not the kind of morality that Ian and I believe the Catholic Church should stand for. Let's look at, again, their second point. That the Catholic Church will be seen as a political actor, that will undermine their ability to interact with other states. Nonsense, ladies and gentlemen. The Catholic Church are already seen as a political actor. They're a state, for God's sake. They have a moral value and they have moral positions. They tell people that they should oppose abortion. They tell people that they should support the freedom of the press. Given that these values impinge upon their interaction with the Bolivarian countries, we think it's consistent for them to stand up and oppose those values when they see them rearing their ugly head. We don't think that's an inconsistent policy for the Catholic Church. In fact, we see not opposing them as being the inconsistent one. The last point they brought was this idea that we might not have any influence. Well, firstly, we said we think that we should try and have an influence. Secondly, we think when the second crop opposition teams stand up and say, these are very Catholic countries. Of course they are. That's the role that the Catholic Church plays in these countries, so we think they do have a large influence, because they are seen as the moral guiders of their flock, ladies and gentlemen, and people ascribe to that belief system. So we think that they can have that influence. But thirdly, ladies and gentlemen, we don't think that they are going to lose this influence with their constituents, because we think that people will see the oppression that's happening. When the Catholic Church brings their attention to the kind of things that are happening, we think people will ascribe to the values that the Catholic Church is setting forward. What kind of things are we talking about, ladies and gentlemen? Well, we're talking about the crackdown of the opposition parties. We're talking about shutting down the free press. We're talking about economic policies that will lead to the devastation of their countries and welfare dependency for decades to come when oil revenue runs out, ladies and gentlemen. Why are all these policies bad? Well, let's look firstly at the freedom of the press and freedom of individuals within the political society. That's a bad environment for any church to operate in, because it denies their members the ability to make their own moral decisions. What happens at the moment, and what's happening, is increasing the imposition of state nationalist values on the entirety of the population. So people don't get the choices for themselves. We think this has potential detriments to the Catholic Church in the future. Let's look at other states that became overtly nationalist. Let's look at other states that try to rule by decree, as Hugo Chavez has tried to do. Let's look at other states that have got overly powerful executives, as Bolivia has. That leads to a situation where churches are less able to put across their moral voice. When you don't stand up to it initially, you have a greater chance of losing your voice in the future. That's a voice that we think the Catholic Church should be very reticent of losing, because we think the chances are the influence that they have at the moment might not be there in the future, because the crackdowns that are currently extending to opposition parties might also extend to groups that are seen in opposition to the government in general. Go on.
What is the first and highest priority of the Catholic Church? Is it to make up political standards? Is it to proselytize for the salvation of souls?
It is to stand up for an unswerving body of morality. Sure, you said in your speech that the Catholic Church has got things wrong in the past. You won't hear us on this side disagree with that. They shamefully stood back and didn't stand up to Hitler. They shamefully stood back and didn't stand up to many despotic regimes around the world. That does not mean that the Catholic Church's values intrinsically mean that. It means that sometimes some members of the Catholic Church have opposed those values. The very core values that are the Catholic Church are peace, harmony, and the brotherhood of man. Now that might sound very corny, but that's their religion and that's what they're going for, ladies and gentlemen. The question you have to ask yourself is, can those values be achieved in the proposition and in the situations the opposition want? And that's where I want to talk about the interaction of religion and politics. It's run throughout my case, but let's look at it explicitly. They're basically saying the church should have some domains for itself and some domains it leaves to the state. We think that denies political agency to actors that have every right to stand up and voice their concerns, just as every other actor does. Why does a citizen who is a priest who is also a citizen of Venezuela have any other right to stand up and give their opinion to any other member of that society? The church is another interest group, an interest group that a large number of people subscribe to, a body of faith that they subscribe to. We think that the interaction of the politics with the state means that the church must stand up for its values. Why should the Catholic Church have interaction with the state? Well, because if it doesn't, its values quite simply becomes meaningless. The kind of Catholic Church that the opposition would have you believe in is a church that exists simply for its own sake. They're saying that the Catholic Church loses its ability to proselytize. It loses its ability to save people's souls. The very core of the Catholic belief system is that if you don't stand up to oppression, if you don't stand up for the values that are embodied in the Catholic Church, then you have no chance of going to heaven. You have no chance of salvation. And that's the Catholic Church that they want to give you today on the opposition. That's the Catholic Church they want. Ian and I have brought you many important points. We've looked at why these countries contravene the core values of the Catholic Church, and we've looked fundamentally why that gives the Catholic Church the right to intervene and to take a political stand. And it's for those two core values that Ian and I will stand here crowning in opposition.
I'd like to thank the speaker for his remarks and call upon the deputy leader of the opposition.
Here, here.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is not an issue, or this is not a choice between what are we going to choose, the ideal of the Catholic Church, or this bastardized issue, or this bastardized version that we've offered here on side opposition. The real choice is between a bad choice and another bad choice. We would agree that in perfect circumstances, in liberal democracies, sure, sometimes the Catholic Church should operate as a moral agent. But we have to recognize, as they were talking about, all the problems they discussed about Bolivarian revolutions, all the repression that they outlined in their case, means that the Catholic Church has a very real choice. They can either continue operating simply as an agent of moral salvation, or they can operate and get involved in politics and become an enemy of the state. And we think that that is a bad situation, or a bad choice for them. Because when they engage as an enemy of the state, that means that they are not able to freely proselytize, they're not able to freely go out and encourage their citizens or encourage their parishioners to continue reading the Bible, because those people are now in jail because they're enemies of the state. You can't proselytize, you can't save people when the government's locking you up or shipping you off, or even in the cases of South America, targeting you specifically, as with the Bishop of El Salvador in the 1980s. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to talk about this. I want to talk about the priorities of the Catholic Church, and I've already discussed this. Ladies and gentlemen, the highest and first priority of the Catholic Church, or even of any church, is that of salvation, of moral salvation. If you're not proselytizing, if you're not getting people on the highway to heaven, then what in God's name are you doing as a religion? If you're allowing your political views to get in the way of your mission, then you're no longer proselytizing religion. You're just another, interestingly enough, political interest group, ladies and gentlemen. And we think that blurring of the lines means that religion is no longer an institution that is sacred or has sanctity and is thus removed from politics and is off limits from these authoritarian dictators, but it makes it a legitimate target as an enemy, as an actor. And we think that making the Catholic Church a legitimate target is dangerous, ladies and gentlemen, because already we've heard from them how authoritarian these regimes are, and we think that they'd be probably bad people if they're a legitimate target. Sure.
Your arguments may be fine rhetorically, but we're talking about a very special instance, specifically in Venezuela, most especially where the Catholic Church is the only appropriate actor who can have this kind of great change.
Okay, now that's a false issue there. They say that they're the only political actor that can affect change. Ladies and gentlemen, last year, Chavez tried to ram through constitutional provisions that said that he would be able to run indefinitely, essentially extending term limits. What happened is that he lost that referendum, and he has essentially term limits placed on him. There is a vibrant opposition in Venezuela. They turned out to be elected. This is not an issue like nobody is operating, nobody's organizing against Chavez. We think that doesn't come into today's debate. Okay. Now, what I want to extend on, ladies and gentlemen, is this analysis of the Red Cross. Ladies and gentlemen, the reason why authoritarian regimes across the world allow the international community of the Red Cross, or the Red Crescent, or the Red Crystal, or whatever banner they're flying under, in which region they're in, the ICRC is allowed into these countries to operate because of their neutrality, because they don't get involved, because they're impartial. Ladies and gentlemen, this impartiality means that they can carry out their jobs. What is the jobs of the Catholic Church? The job of the Catholic Church is to save lives, save people's souls. You cannot do that if the government doesn't want you operating in its own country, like in China. You cannot do that, like in El Salvador, when the Bishop of El Salvador was himself targeted for murder. And the dynamics of a flock are that when the leader is gone, then the organization goes through a problem that they can't even effectively organize anymore, ladies and gentlemen. This is an issue of what do we do? The Catholic Church cannot take stands like this in these countries because they will not be able to operate in a second. Ladies and gentlemen, what we say, ladies and gentlemen, is essentially this.
They're offering us that somehow, in China, if we say that they should get involved, that there's somehow going to be continued proselytization. There's somehow going to be continued action. Ladies and gentlemen, the International Committee of the Red Cross delivers its services because people trust it not to get involved in politics. Ladies and gentlemen, and let's look at additionally the Catholic Church. We agree that the Catholic Church delivers social services. We think that's pretty self-evident. But those services cannot be delivered if they are getting inside politics. They can't deliver food, or they can't deliver aid, or they can't deliver these things if they're perceived as a political actor. And if those food packages, or if that aid is going to someone that the government sees as an enemy of the state, or on a different political side of the spectrum.
Sure. Sir, you're saying they cannot save souls if they use their political power. How can they save souls if they abandon the very values that are mentioned in that?
There's a difference between having a higher ideal and actively engaging in it and actively organizing political groups and telling people to vote certain ways, ladies and gentlemen. We think that this fine line makes it so that churches can operate in China, and on one hand, and churches get cracked down on in China. Which is the better choice? We think on the opposition. We think that church-state out of politics is where it needs to be. The last issue I want to talk about is this perceived inconsistency with Bolivarian revolution. Ladies and gentlemen, I haven't been in the site of church in a long time, but one thing that struck with me for a long time is the idea of how we treat the least of these. Ladies and gentlemen, the Bolivarian revolution, as one of its central tenets, is that of socialism, or is that of redistribution of wealth. And while they're right, you do have to work for what you get. Jesus Christ did not stand on the temple, or did not stand and say, you can be lazy and we'll help you out. But one of the things is that how we treat the least positioned in our society. And the Catholic Church has taken an active stance of redistributing, of helping these least positions in our society, ladies and gentlemen. That cannot happen if we're politicized. That can't happen if essentially they're on the run from the government. Ladies and gentlemen, that's not inconsistent with the main tenets of the Bolivarian revolution. So this attempt to draw fine distinctions doesn't exist in the first proposition. We've told you that on a matter of practicality, the Catholic Church has first and foremost its job of proselytizing and saving souls. And secondly, that the practicalities mean that to continue to save souls and to continue to deliver social services, they have to stay out of politics. Ladies and gentlemen, for these reasons, we think that it's not a good idea to make the Catholic Church a legitimate target for the agents of an authoritarian government. We think keep them as a sacred, separate institution that is off limits to politics. For these reasons, we're proud to oppose.
So ladies and gentlemen, I want to ask a question at this point. I don't want to ask exactly what problems, ladies and gentlemen, we think it's absolutely time for the Catholic Church to take a stand against something that we think is inherently harmful to South America. But secondly, let's look at South American countries. Ladies and gentlemen, when Simon Bolivar wrote the Constitution for Venezuela, he envisaged a benevolent dictator holding power in Venezuela forever. We don't think that's a good idea when there's no debate about what your government's doing, particularly when we're talking about developing countries. So ladies and gentlemen, we'd say that these countries need two things. One, they need to hear dissenting opinion, and two, they need room for debate. And we think the Catholic Church is well positioned to give them both of those things. So that's what I'm going to look at in my extension. First, I'm going to talk about how there isn't any opposition in Venezuela or in Bolivia, and where, or at the very least, we think that opposition is being cracked down upon. Because we think it's absolutely a no-brainer that democracy requires diversity of opinion and it requires debate. And whether you like Chavez or not, ladies and gentlemen, a constitutional dictatorship that's based on the Bolivarian principles, we think, is going to destroy those very things. So, ladies and gentlemen, we'd say that when the opposition says to us the Catholic Church shouldn't provide opposition, we want to ask them who will.
If you want to have this church acting as a political actor, doesn't that alienate people that disagree with its political position?
Well, no, we don't think that that's the case. We'd say, firstly, we don't think many people are going to disagree with the idea that if you live in a democracy, you're allowed to say bad things about a government that you don't really agree with. But secondly, we'd say that even if people do oppose the Catholic Church or the Catholic Church's stand on, say, the idea that you should have free speech in Venezuela, we think that's a price that the Catholic Church has to be prepared to pay, because we think that the Catholic Church stands for fundamental principles of social justice. And we don't think that the Catholic Church should sacrifice those principles just so that they get some votes from crazy people who'd like to live in a dictatorship, or sorry, get some church attendance by those people. So, ladies and gentlemen, when we look at the fact that opposition is being repressed, that there's no opposition in these countries, we need to ask why. We'd say, firstly, the media is being suppressed. We've seen the closure of Radio Caucus Television, we've seen it being called fascist or coup plotters, and one-third of Venezuelans actually watch that television station. So we think that's pretty serious. Secondly, we've seen a crackdown on opposition parties, ladies and gentlemen, and we've now seen Chavez funding Morales to crack down on his opposition parties as well. We think that's inherently harmful. But thirdly, and most importantly, there's no dependence on foreign nations when you're talking about Venezuela and when you're talking about Bolivia. That's why we saw Chavez say he was going to pull out of the IMF and pull out of the World Bank. They rely on oil reserves, ladies and gentlemen, and so do all of we, so do all of us. And so we'd say, ladies and gentlemen, that in that context, we can't put foreign pressure on these regimes. We think they're a very special case. So how does the Catholic Church help deal with this special case? Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've heard from the first half that the Catholic Church needs to act now before they crack down on. But we think, ladies and gentlemen, that it's pretty hard for the Catholic Church to be cracked down on. We think the Catholic Church plays a very special role in South America in that they are the bastion of, in that they do have a huge audience who's willing to listen to what the Catholic Church has to say. Because, ladies and gentlemen, South Americans love their Kolerok leaders, but more than that, they love their parish priests, ladies and gentlemen. So we think that when a parish priest stands up and starts to talk about social justice in the context of having free debate, we think that's going to be really important, and it's really going to affect the way that Venezuelans or Bolivians think about those kinds of issues. But more importantly than that, ladies and gentlemen, we think that the Catholic Church has a lot of influence in these countries in that the Catholic Church does provide services to people. Because the Catholic Church runs schools in Venezuela, they run schools in Bolivia, ladies and gentlemen. And when we see Hugo Chavez or even Morales saying that those schools have to teach curriculum with an ideological tainting, ladies and gentlemen, we think the Catholic Church has an amazing role to play in providing an education, ladies and gentlemen, that provides more space for debate. And we don't think that in the same way that state-run schools can be dictated to by political opinion, Catholic schools are in the same boat. So where are we at in today's debate, ladies and gentlemen? Well, we had a great debate at first half about general principles about the interaction between church and state. What Anisah and I have done is put this into the context of Venezuela and Bolivia. We've told you that these countries are very special cases because of the way that opposition is being cracked down upon
idea of a political church and a moral church. And what I think was successfully demonstrated by side first opposite was that a moral church is the model that the Catholic Church must aspire to, must adhere to, and that the role that politics should play in being a moral church is where one of two things are placed at risk. And this is what Evan and I wish to extend upon. We want to give you the ideas of standards for where the Catholic Church actually should ever choose to take political action. We have 4 of them, and we think they all have to be met before the church can go ahead and do these things. The first is sort of the nature of the problem which the church seeks to address. And we say that it has to be one of 2 things. Clearly, when some political body or some nation is pursuing conduct which is directly in violation of theological conditions of the Catholic Church, i.e. those places which wish to propagate abortion, gay marriage, what have you, then the church has their own internal moral obligation to act. We don't think that's what's relevant in this particular case, however. And we think that where political obligation to act is further conferred upon the church is where we see immediate threats to people. We heard a lot of really good argumentation out of Side's second proposition about why Bolivia, why Venezuela are doing things that are dangerous on an economic scale globally, why they're doing things that we don't like as a community of nations. What we didn't hear is the terrible things that they're doing to the poor classes of Venezuela and Bolivia who have actually sought out the sort of self-governance that these Bolivarian leaders are offering them, who actually sought out the right to grow coca because they believed that it would revitalize their economy. Ultimately, what we would argue on our side of the house is that until these individuals are actually being undermined, until these people are actually being harmed, and more importantly, until the threat of harm is entirely immediate, the Catholic Church should not take political action. That they should act where there exists an immediate risk of harm to individuals, not where they're ultimately engaging in a controversial debate over what economic and foreign policy mechanisms should reign supreme. At that point, the Catholic Church is expressing a position. They're conflicting against the position of a state that could actually be considered to be legitimate. But the second condition that we would argue would need to be satisfied before church political action can be taken is when the conduct that they can actually encourage their parishioners to take can be described in positive terms. Not simply vote against this thing, but actively do this other thing. We think that the church should seek to encourage personal conduct, not merely political conduct. And we haven't heard an actual argument for something positive that the church is going to seek its parishioners to do.
Free elections are just as intrinsic value to the Catholic Church as opposing abortion. How have you picked and chosen the ones that you think they should fit in? Because we think you pick them because they don't fit in.
So I'm unfamiliar where it is in church doctrine that it says anything about free elections, right? The church is a lot of countries to support countries that are not democracies. So I think in democracies, in these countries where you don't have any elections, let alone free elections, right? Like, I think this is ludicrous. And so at that point, especially when those free elections, or excuse me, lack of free elections, aren't really having negative impacts on the people on the ground, then we really shouldn't be concerned with that particular issue. But the further thing that we would say, ultimately, is that the church should be engaging with issues where these problems arise, not directly with governments. That the church, for instance, had they intervened in the Holocaust, should have sought to stop the Holocaust, not sought to fight Hitler directly. And I realize that that's an odd distinction to draw, but we think it's a crucial one. We think that the church has an obligation to try to avoid conflict. As we heard from all sides in this round, the church is about promoting peace. And we think that that's undermined to the point that they find themselves in tension with governments, who they may very well have to work with if they want to affect further change once they've affected the change they want to see in the first place. Who they're going to alienate the people of these nations, because these people who look to Chavez, who look to, historically Bolivar, who look to Morales, as on some level, individuals of salvation, leaders who are giving them a different kind of hope. We place the church in tension with these individuals, and then put the people in the position where they must choose between the person giving them spiritual salvation and the person putting food on their table. We think at that point that it's an unreasonable choice to ask of these people and then still expect their loyalty to remain entirely and completely within the church. The example that we is that if the Turkish government were to choose to invade Kurdistan, the church should take issue with that conduct, not issue with the Turkish government. The third standard we would give you is that the church should only do things when they have an actual chance of efficacy. We've heard about Hyperion spheres of influence inside first opposite. And what we think is important to note is that voting simply isn't going to be enough. That what's been encouraged of the church to cross into the political sphere won't actually have any solvency in these nations. The fourth condition that we would put on this, that we also think is similarly not met by Proposition's model, is that the church should exhaust all remedies before seeking direct conflict action against these individuals. That the church should seek to remedy these things in a non-confrontational manner for all of the reasons that we've already described. What did we hear today from side second proposition? I'm sorry to say, I just don't think it was all that much. The first thing that we heard is that, look, no opposition exists, right, in these nations, and we hear that the church is the group that can provide that opposition. The difficulty is that the church can't be the group to provide that opposition, at the point that individuals on the ground, particularly in Latin American nations, are going to be torn between the church and between these leaders. We can't look to the church to provide opposition when the church is one of two groups fulfilling a central role in these people's lives.
We're not asking your church to say we hate Chavez. We're asking them to say don't entrench somebody.
Okay, great. You're now asking individuals to draw the distinction between vote against these people in all circumstances and, but we don't hate these people. I don't think that that's at all remotely rational, right? When the position is do everything you can to keep these people out of power. That sounds an awful lot to an individual on the ground, like, we hate these people and we oppose everything it is they're doing. That's why we think they should be out of office. That's an awfully conflicting message to send to individuals on the ground. That's ridiculous. Then we hear that Chavez and Morales are really bad. But look to every piece of analysis we heard on why Bolivarian states and status quo are problematic. We didn't, again, hear analysis on why they're bad for Catholics on the ground, why they're bad for potential future Catholics on the ground. The Catholic Church's ability to convert people is not undermined when they can go to these people and say, look, we're great with these people who are helping you out. You should be great with us as well. The final thing that we hear is that people are going to listen to you, that the church has that unique position. I feel like I'm beating a dead horse here, but I guess that's because they just based everything on this one idea, which simply isn't true. At the point that that tension, the church gets insolvency in these nations. At the point that this tension exists, the Catholic Church must seek other options in these nations. This simply isn't their fight. This simply isn't the time. We stand on it.
I'd like to thank the speaker for his remarks and call the government whip to close the government side.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I'm honored to speak before you today, and I'm especially honored to close out the case for side second proposition, or as I like to call us, side real facts about the world. So first of all, I want to deal with a little bit of direct refutation with what second opposition has called, or I guess we want to give them a team name, continuation of the themes that first followed under a different name. But first of all, I want to continue with some specific refutation because we think that they gave us a fairly detailed model of when they think the church should act. I want to class with these point by point. First of all, we heard that one of these standards for action is when there's actual violation of theological values to the church and how this doesn't fall into this case. However, we would like to severely clash with this. We think things like the equality of each soul under the church is important, and interdemocracy is represented by things like free elections. That's why the Catholic Church considers free elections important. Things like damaging effects that Chavez is having on the environment. Things like the fact that his monetary policies result in mass oil production, in cheap oil, in pollution, in actual danger to the livelihood and life of people. We think that's something the Catholic Church should stand against. We think the basic safety and freedom of its denizens and the souls under its protection are fundamental theological violations of why they should act in this case. Secondly, we heard about this idea about how it needs to inspire positive action. And this leads into sort of a huge misconstrual by the speaker about the idea that we're somehow saying that the Catholic Church should actively impeach Chavez or somehow invade. They're talking a lot about how we're talking about the Catholic Church should take these active actions. It's not what we were saying at all. We're talking about how they can make a stance and a philosophical kind of preach to their citizens about how things that are happening are wrong, about how these citizens should try to do something about it. And what we think is that the Catholic Church is uniquely poised in this respect because of the nature of its influence, because it's a universal, calming kind of influence that we don't have anywhere else in Venezuela, because of this fractionalization of opposition we've heard about, and because of some of the increasing violence among these fractional groups that are losing their appeal to populism. I think what the Catholic Church can do is come in and give a calming and unifying voice to the situation because of what Claudia talked to you about their unique position within Venezuela. And we heard about this again leads into how they should engage with issues and not with government. But in this case, it's the government who's causing the issues. We think it's perfectly within the prerogative of the Catholic Church And lastly, we heard about this, about how they should only act when they can be effective and when we've already exhausted all remedies. But what we would say to them is that is, in fact, has already happened. Because we talked to you a lot about Claudia's speech, which I guess wasn't really heard. I don't know if you can't understand her accent or something, but I could. We heard a lot about why the Catholic Church can be effective, why the Catholic Church has this unique influence over the hearts and minds of the people of Venezuela, why they can be effective, so we fulfill this criteria. And lastly, about exhausting all of the remedies, we also talked to you about this, about reasons why the opposition can't unite because of things like repression of the press, reasons why any other kind of outside influence, things like economic sanctions or any other kind of foreign diplomacy aren't effective because of the unique power situation of Venezuela. So we think that really we'd like to thank them for presenting this criteria because it actually falls exclusively on our side.
Okay, so just out of curiosity, how can you still claim that there's efficacy when we've shown you the fundamental tension between church and state in this country?
What we've said in this country is that he's alleging that somehow any influence by the church will be cracked down upon and repressed by the state. We say in that case that's not going to happen because the Catholic Church has such a universal sway over the hearts and minds of the people, and that Chavez can't afford to risk that kind of crackdown against the Catholic Church in fear of repercussions, and we think that he's not going to do that. So I'd like to move into a summary of the round. Because I think that what we've heard about so far that we really need to talk about is why is the situation bad? Why is there this terror to act? And secondly, about the idea about why it is within the prerogative of the Catholic Church to act in situations. So first of all, why the situation currently is bad. I think we've heard a lot of this on the proposition side of the house. We've talked about things like, first of all, dangerous economic and political policy. We've also talked about the impact that these has on the people. Things like fractionalizing of opposition, like increasing violence amongst opposition, like even some of Chavez's monetary policies that have environmental harms. We think that there are very tangible harms of this regime and of this movement, and especially the idea that only Claudia talked to you about a fundamental idea of the Bolivarian movement, about this permanent entrenching of the leader. We think that that takes away the freedom from the people. We think that it's a fundamental tenet of the Catholic Church to have this equality amongst its citizens and equality amongst souls. And we think that's why it really is a bad situation that does in fact need to be remedied. So now I'm going to talk to you about why it is the role of the Catholic Church specifically in order to be able to act. Because we've heard a lot in the front half about this back and forth idea, but why or why not the Catholic Church is in fact invested in this and is against this. But we think we've been uniquely brought to you on the second proposition is why it's particularly this actor that can be effective and appropriate in this situation. We've talked a lot about why other forms of influence won't in fact work in this negative situation. We've talked about why the Catholic Church can have this kind of power. Because it has a unique hold over the hearts and minds of the citizens. It can act as this uniting and calming influence that has been missing in Venezuela that we think is sorely needed in order to have an appropriate state and to have a fair state and to bring true peace and true stability to the people. We think that's very much within the interest of the Catholic Church and within the interest of the world as a whole. And so what we think in this situation is that the Catholic Church has to in fact be the one to act and should be the one to act. But first I'll take you
When you make the Catholic Church a political actor, they're an okay target for politicians, and who's to lead the flock?
First of all, we kind of deny the fact. We think we've heard a lot on this side that the Catholic Church somehow magically isn't politicized, is exclusively moral. But moreover, we've brought to you on second proposition why in this case morality and politics are linked. Why the politics in the country are leading to the generation of the morality of the country, of things like the attraction of the people. We think in this case there is a moral imperative as well as a political, even if you don't buy the fact that the Catholic Church can in fact be politicized. So what we think we've really brought to you in this debate, especially outside second proposition, is the ground the Catholic Church is an imperative need to change something in this current situation because there are such changes. And secondly, why the Catholic Church is particularly poised to act. Because we don't think that this kind of backlash can or even will happen in this situation because it is so entrenched in the minds of the people. We think that the forum of priests and of the church provides a unique medium of discourse amongst people where they can express their opinions without freedom from backlash like we've seen in the media. We think that this can provide a very free and fair thing and that it's very much in the interest of the Catholic Church to protect the souls under its care, to protect its citizens, in order to be able to act in this way. We don't think that it will have these negative repercussions. That's how opposition has been talking about. And for these reasons, we stand proudly in opposition.
To a close. Here, here.
Thank you so much for coming up here, Madam Speaker. I think it's important to take a look at the chronology of where this round has gone before finally taking a look at how the back half is focused on the requirements that would have to be met for the church to take action and whether or not it would be the appropriate idea. I think to take a look at the first round, there was a lot of debate about how there should probably be skepticism about a policy of inaction, because people assert that if you do something that isn't an action, you might be doing it just because you want to avoid some consequences that would make it difficult for you to deal with the political capital. I think the burden that left Mark and I with on second opposition was to say that whatever the harms could be to the Catholic Church were in fact real enough, present enough, and harmful enough that taking that sort of action, especially if it wasn't going to be effective to achieve the goals that the Catholic Church would like to get to, is something that should make inaction actually the appropriate way to go through this. And I think before we go through the discussion that we've been having in the back half, there's a need for a reality check across all of government benches on two different fronts. The first is the idea of how bad things really are on the ground, specifically in places like Venezuela. Because we've been getting a lot of rhetoric about how you need to fix the economy so that there are souls remaining that you can save in order to do the things that you want to on a theological front. This is where Mark and I talk about the immediacy of the need. Because the people of Venezuela aren't disappearing because of poor economic policies. We think that to say that the Catholic Church needs to make its first priority dealing in the political realm rather than dealing in the theological realm would require it to be the sort of situation that they pretend like it is on the government benches. We hear from the member of government that you need to save the economy before the people. This is where we think they've gone too far in asserting that the Catholic Church can also be a political tool. Because it's true that the Catholic Church gets involved on some level into politics. That doesn't mean that they become the speaker for when a certain country has economic policies that they disagree with. They go and try and reform economic policy. Guess whose job that is? It's legislators and governments, not the role of the Catholic Church. Then we hear, and we want to respond to the over-exaggeration of how the church needs to be a political defender when these political rights also deal in the moral realm. Madam Speaker, in everywhere, there are things that are political actions that aren't perfectly in line with the church's ideals. The United States has certainly had its times that it's cracked down on free speech, and that isn't justification for the Catholic Church to put themselves in direct opposition to the United States because of the harms that it would incur. So where do we say the Catholic Church does eventually have the right to get themselves involved, not at this time, to take that sort of direct opposition? The first thing that Mark and I tell you needs to be the case is for it to be a focus on theological violations. The response we get, no thank you, from that half is that there is theological violations. Look at the oil wealth and how it's poorly distributed. That's not theological violation. We think the fact that there are poor people who don't have some of their rights because they're poor isn't the sort of ideas of God and soul and salvation that the church needs to be focusing on. We think that's particularly, I'll take you in just a second, the sort of political realm that's too far entrenched into dealing with politics and economics for the church to maintain its ability to say that they are the correct body for people to look to on issues of the soul.
Given that I can only assume that your bench doesn't want shadows to change the Constitution to entrench his rule for the rest of his life, what's your alternative to the church providing a dissenting voice on this issue?
So we think that opposition from the people has existed. We think at the point that the people are at this point actually looking for the sort of salvation that is the Robin Hood sort of actions that give something to the people, that there's enough of a justification to say that the people of Venezuela shouldn't have the church going and not only breaking the ability of the church to provide salvation for them, but also all of the analysis that Mark provides to you, causing them to be in a situation where they now need to choose between saying, uh-oh, the church is telling me not to do what I think is my best interest here, but I also want to follow the church and their beliefs, and having the church put themselves in a situation where they not only cause internal harms to themselves, but lose the ability of the people to side with them because some of those people want to support what they have been getting. The second idea that Mark and I talk about what would need to be a prerequisite, is the idea of dealing with the issues rather than dealing with the government. The responses that we've had over the course of this round on the opposition benches is the idea that it is the government who's propagating these issues. That's not enough of a justification for you to speak out against the government. If the government is doing particular things that you think are in direct violation of your theological values, fine, do that. At the point that you're willing to extend that 1 degree of separation out to the government, we think that you are now not in fact dealing with things like moral issues, because you are necessarily, in their own words, dealing with things like governments. We think this is the point at which the Catholic Church needs to know its boundaries needs to be able to say that only when they are the protector and defender of the issues, not how they're connected to the ways that people use them in specific countries, you're actually going to get those benefits. But what else do we also tell you? We tell you it would need to be effective. The alternative that we've gotten on the back half here in government side is that there is no opposition. We think that the opposition that has existed, and further, the ideas of the people who would find opposition to the church imposing their ideas on them, is enough to say that this isn't the role that the church should get involved in. We think these are the important reasons upon which we have to recognize that the Catholic Church can't involve themselves in this role. We think the most important question today about whether or not the Catholic Church should directly oppose the Bolivarian Revolution can't just be about whether or not there is an aspect of the Bolivarian Revolution that the Catholic Church would prefer to be a different way. That's not enough of a standard. We think at the point that the Church does have its foremost priorities, and that those aren't things that are being directly violated. Moreover, that the only way that government benches can make a claim to the idea that there has been any violation at all is to say that it's particular government's policies that the church, therefore, because it has previously been political, needs to get themselves involved in is preposterous. We recognize here on second opposition that the church does have to have a pretty high barrier to entry before saying that they're going to make a particular issue of opposing a group that's doing something mostly wrong in the church's mind on a political realm. We think that losing the capital that you have with the people on the ground to say that you are the appropriate religious authority is not a sacrifice that you can make at the point that it's not your job as the church, who is an institution that is in fact supposed to focus more on the theological idea rather than about whether or not there are governments who are doing a poor distribution of the wealth that's coming from oil. We think that what we've established for you here in the back half on side opposition is the idea that the church can't get itself involved in every situation just because there's some dissent. We think it needs to be a much higher burden, as explained in our core standards that hasn't been met. We're proud of it.
I'd like to thank the speaker for his remarks and call this debate to a close.
prosecution talked a lot about this. They can't do this. There's going to be lots of prosecution of the Catholic Church, that sort of thing. But it just wouldn't happen, right? Because the Catholic Church is so important in Latin America, in Venezuela, Chavez just couldn't do it, right? But I mean, the first thing about it, the Latin American Catholic Church is like somewhat separate from like the Roman Catholic Church, right? Like liberation theology in the 60s like that, there's a long tradition of like being kind of like independent in some really important ways. I mean, Chavez did the exact same thing that Hitler did, right, with the church, which is like get rid of the leaders you don't like, find people you do like, give them lots of money in important positions, you keep the church, now it's on your side. Like it's really, really easy for them to do that and keep the importance of the Catholic Church and actually like turn it against the populace or whatever they want to do with their country. So I thought that was kind of like something that wasn't addressed as much by side opposition. Cool.
Anyone for cross benches? Kevin? Oh, cross benches? Proposition? Go on.
Alright, so what we've heard proposition talk so far about why the Bolivarian Revolution is bad. We talked about repression and things like that. What I really haven't talked about is the statist ideology and how that is in direct contravention to the idea of Catholicism. And that Catholicism is not merely a religion of action, but a religion of thought. And that at the center of your life has to be the idea that Jesus Christ is your personal savior. You have to view things through a moral lens. Love your neighbor, things like that. Whereas socialism, in fact, has different sorts of ways of looking at things. Looking at it through a classist perspective, where you have the upper class suppressing you, which is in direct contravention to love your neighbor. You have the idea that economic benefit should be the end-all and be-all of your life. And you have this idea that the state is the final arbiter of all things. And that basically, that is in direct contravention of the sort of value system which underlies Catholic ideology. And that if we allow the Bolivarian Revolution to put this new sort of left-wing socialist value system in place in Venezuela, that will undermine the long-term ability of the Catholic Church to be able to proselytize and bring recruits and to save souls. And that for that reason, it would be very bad.
Here. One more for opposition. Sir. Well, if we still got more after, we can do a couple of questions.
Hi, I'm the speaker. I'm not going to use exaggerated expressions to explain my point, but normally, from theologically speaking, we always look at the track record of how religion takes the morality issue and takes part in the government to actually benefit the people. But with the religion, who has a track record of not 10 years, not 20 years, not 30 years, not 100, not 200, but 300 years of running politics, the dark ages, I don't know if I can actually trust them. Here, we are talking about the revolution. Probably only one, at most 2 generations of suffering. But when Catholic religion actually ran Europe, not one country, but countries from England all the way to Poland, maybe even Russia was affected, and not 1 generation, but 6 generations were affected. And we all know that people actually died, not 100, not 200, not a million, but actually, as the numbers say, somewhere between 10 to 20 million people died. I don't know if someone in the religion's aspect should take that big of a burden when there are other resources that become used. That's my point.
For cross benches, Jack.
I think what we heard from second prop was almost enough to take the rounds. I think that first point about why there aren't any other relevant actors that can change the regimes in South America. That was a really good point. I think it was very well done. But I think that the second point we heard in the extension about why the Catholic Church in South American nations is particularly good at doing this, I think that needed to be fleshed out. I think they need to show 4 things. I think they need to show why it is that religion can have this kind of impact, why it is that specifically you can have, so I think they talk about sort of why metaphysical punishment and reward is a really good incentive, and why, and also why just religion is so societally ordering that everyone kind of buys what you say. Second of all, why it's important in South America, specifically giving analysis of how Catholic South America is. Third of all, saying why it is that, third of all, is just showing those 2 points show that you can kind of have an influence. And fourth, I think we need to show how persecution is really difficult in this case. And for that, just insert Patrick's brand. I think if they'd done that, I think they had amazing case, or extension. Yeah.
Here. All right. Last round. Anyone else for proposition? Yeah.
To represent the genuine Catholic University of Denver. I think I agree very much with the first gentleman that stood up. He said that the Catholic Church has often taken a position that causes them to become martyrs. When you become a priest in the Catholic Church, you become a nun, you're saying, when you've made your peace with God, you're now going to go represent God on earth and try to do his good works of Jesus Christ. If you stand up, and you're, as some people mentioned in the debate, the loved parish priest, one of two things is going to happen. Either the people are going to nod their heads and go, yes, what you're telling us is true, this is an oppressive regime and we should oppose it, or the police are going to kick in the door and drag you out and try to silence you. I think the people's reaction is going to be exactly the same as if Chavez lets you talk, which is they're going to say, this is bull, let's get rid of this government. It's a win-win situation for both the people and the Catholic Church. The only person that loses is the government in power, Hugo Chavez. Because the people that are getting punished by this are the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is taking the responsibility on themselves to say, we're not going to let the average Venezuelan citizen get hurt by this. We're going to stand up and be the martyrs, and the average Venezuelan citizen is going to be protected. That's what the job of the Catholic Church is to speak when other people can't speak. They have the ability to stand up and say, we're going to take the risk of being martyred on ourselves to protect you. And so in this case, I think, with Venezuela, either way the Catholic Church succeeds because it institutes change in a moral way for its people, and if the only downside is that the Catholic priests in the area have to be heard, frankly, every single one of those men and women made a deal with God that is something that they are willing to risk for the better good of all of humanity.
Final one for opposition. Yeah, go for it.
Thank you. I suppose the biggest flaw that we could see from the government side is the idea that the average Venezuelan who is poor and likely illiterate is going to find these great constitutional discussions to be more important than their food and shelter. It is true that Hugo Chavez has been able to get some economic incentive for the people to support him. If the Catholic Church comes in and says, yes, but at the same time he's limiting your freedom of speech and wants to be elected for life, this average citizen might be saying, well, my stomach is full. I feel comfortable in this situation. Why should I care that my president wants to be elected for life? My pope is elected for life. It's going to be a very difficult situation for the Catholic Church to come in. For the Catholic Church to come in and say, you may be feeling that your economic needs are being met, but these high liberal ideals aren't being met. Which do you prefer more? Your safety, security, shelter, and food, or these ideals that we uphold because we are smarter than you, because we've read more books? Could be a very interesting issue for the poor to agree either with those who are coming from this liberal and high-minded idea, or their simple everyday needs. So the Church would have to find a very convincing way to balance the two needs there.
Final one, cross benches. Who's there?
Okay, I've never given a speech from the floor, and I missed the first couple because I had to make a phone call, so hopefully I'm not just repeating someone. But I know Richard would be really happy if I talked about liberation theology. Because liberation is actually about not that there's a repressive government and the church is against the government, but that members of the church, sort of these rogue socialist priests, are telling people that the church supports what Chavez does, that liberation theology, which is this socialist ideal that the church needs to have social justice mechanisms and have redistributive policies and not just preach, that these rogue socialist priests are taking that message and telling the people of Venezuela, you have to support Chavez because your Catholic Church commands you to support Chavez and his redistributive policies. So at that point, it's no longer a debate about you're cracking down on the media versus they'll crack down on you. It's what do you do with your priests? Are you going to tell them they're wrong? Or are you going to say maybe this is liberation theology and maybe we should support Chavez? So I don't know which way that debate comes out, but I know it's a very different debate. Talking about is liberation theology a valid theology, and if it is, are these priests doing it right, and should the Catholic Church support it in this instance?
Okay, 1 second. Okay, so while we have everyone here, I've been told to stall. Yeah, tournament announcements from anyone. I know we have a couple coming up. Mr. Marr.
The University of Ottawa is indeed hosting a tournament.
Woo!
The tournament will be on the 7th through the 9th of November. Monica Ferris is our chief adjudicator, so if you like the round about pornography here, you'll love our entire tournament. The registration is $100 a team, $50 a person. Sarah Ingmanson is the tournament director. You may remember her from other Hart House tournaments. I'm going to be running tabs. We're going to have shawarma. We're going to have garlic potatoes. We're not going to run out, and our tab will be ruthlessly fast.
Hey,
are there any questions?
I've never knocked your tab.
You can't.
Well, we'll see.
Are there any questions? Okay, the contact person for this tournament is Sarah Ingmanson. Failing that, just message me through CUSID.net, and I will make sure that she gets any questions and any registrations you have. Are there any questions right now? Awesome.
Cool. Any other announcements? What?
Hi, my name is Christine, and I'm president of the Queen's Debating Union this year. As many of you know, we're hosting the British Parliamentary National Championships the weekend of November 21st to 23rd. Our tournament director's name is Ashton Toulon, but she's not here this weekend. So if you have any questions afterwards, please come up and ask me. We already have more teams than what our initial team cap was. If you have not registered, you can let us know how many teams you would like to send. We're going to create a waiting list, and we'll be getting back to all the teams. We did ask you to confirm that the team numbers you originally told us you were going to bring are the actual number of teams you're bringing to the tournament. If you asked for 6 teams, please let me know if you can't bring that many teams so that we can allot those spaces to other teams. Please do that in the next week. All of the tournament details, including registration, contact, hotel deals, is all on CUSID.net and AfterWeb. So please consult that for email addresses and more details, and come and ask me if you have any questions afterwards. Thanks.
Anyone else? Tournament announcements. Miguel, I know you guys got one. Not for a while. Whatever. I'm sure if Derek were...
I'm supposed to announce one that I have nothing to do with.
Okay, go for it.
All right. So you guys have heard of Hobart and William Smith?